What's the price of perfection?
Oh. I'll take your soul.
I talk about a lot of motorcycles on this channel. I've covered everything from sport touring, sport bike, naked bike, supermotos, all kinds of bikes under the sun. But a lot of people keep asking me why I don't talk about this motorcycle right here. This is the Triumph Street Triple R. Most people look at this bike and they see a phenomenally capable street weapon, and they're not wrong. This is a great motorcycle, but it has been so polished smooth that it has no personality, and personally, I don't really like riding it. Today, what I'm gonna try to show you is why I think that chasing perfection results in a lukewarm, watered down experience that just doesn't make me want to reach for the keys. Now, to understand this motorcycle properly, we have to wind back the clock to 1993 and talk about the Speed Triple.
Triumph's real big on heritage, claiming that the Speed Triple developed in the early 90s was a callback to the original Speed Twin from 1938. Drawing that line is something that only the most devoted of Triumph cult members can do. In reality, Triumph just looked around their factory and thought, what could we reuse to make a sweet bike? They had a triple just sitting around in the Daytona and thought, good enough. They pulled the fairings off, bored it out to 1050 cc's, and put some headlights on it and called it a day. The problem is, people liked it, like a lot. Fast forward a few years and the 1050 is suddenly now a 1200, making 177 horsepower, which isn't a great bike for somebody looking to upgrade from an MT-07. So they took a triple they just had sitting around in a Daytona, took the fairings off, changed the gearing, and called it a day. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but Triumph has a 30-year history of turning Daytonas into naked bikes with limited modifications. The funny thing is now you have Triumph turning street triples back into Daytonas with their Moto2 765 carbon experiment. I actually rode one of those back in the day, and boy oh boy, that sure was an uncomfortable street triple, but that's besides the point. Right now, you can buy two versions of the Street Triple. The R, which we're looking at today, is $10,945. It's got a 765cc triple putting down 116 horsepower and 57 foot-pounds of torque. It's got fully adjustable suspension, programmable ride modes, quick shifter, the works. Then for people looking to spend a little bit more cash, you've got the RS. And for $2 extra grand, you get a TFT dash, 5 more horsepower, 1 more torque, and profit. If you ask me, anybody looking at a street triple should just save the $2 grand and get the R. Sure, the instrument cluster is dumb, and they should have just used the one off the old Daytona with the sweeping needle, but your average Joe won't notice the difference on the street because as a platform, the street triple, it's just that good. And guys, real quick, before we hit the road, I wanted to remind you that today is the last day to take advantage of the Cardo Spring Flash Sale. You get 25% off using the code SPITE10 down below. That's 25% off everything in the Cardo store. Today's your last day, so click that link.
There is very little that can compare to a street triple on a twisty road. This thing is, I would go so far as to call it the superlative riding experience for a twisty road. This thing it's so good. I've ridden a lot of motorcycles and I always come back to the Street Triple. It's just one of the best around a corner I've ever ridden. Now, why? Why is it so good around a corner? Well, obviously they have had 30 years of development in the street and speed platform. Side to side, this thing is razor sharp. The ergonomic setup on this motorcycle is so well thought out that you can just move around easily on this motorcycle, and it flips from side to side so quickly it's almost telepathic. There are very few motorcycles I've been this plugged into after such a short period of time. I don't have to think to do a damn thing on this bike. it just does the work for you. It's so good. And the motor, because it's so linear, you make such nice power, you really don't have to worry about switching gears. You know exactly where you are just by listening to this motor. And it is paired with phenomenal brakes. Absolutely phenomenal. No matter how fast you're going on this bike, if you're bold enough and brave enough, these brakes are going to be able to keep up with you. It truly is the perfect package for a twisty road. The only problem is not every road's a twisty road, and sometimes you gotta commute.
This bike has a 32.5-inch seat height and a subframe that looks very suspiciously familiar, shall we say. When you get on this motorcycle, you feel a sport heritage here. My bottom half is very aggressively set up, and it feels like I'm ready to hit a corner. The only problem is that doesn't necessarily translate well to a normal road situation.
Getting on the highway, those ergonomics result in kind of a mixed bag. The lower half of my body is feeling very sportified. I have a very aggressive bend in my knees, and I can definitely feel it already. This bike wants you. It requires you to keep your feet on the pegs with your toes. If you start dropping your feet, the ergonomics kind of fall apart. I don't feel like I have as good control of the motorcycle as I do when my toes are on the pegs, my knees are in the tank, and I can really start moving with my whole body. Now that's obviously exactly what this motorcycle was designed for. It was designed for you to ride it in this aggressive stance. But why am I in this aggressive stance when I'm right behind a 4Runner? And now I'm going to say something that is going to piss so many people off. Because this motorcycle's power plant and power delivery is so linear, it feels more like I'm riding an electric motorcycle than an ICE bike. There's no peak, there's no valley, there's no trough for this bike to fall into in the mid-range, and there's no high-end rush to chase. So it feels artificial, it feels stale. Now, obviously, there's plenty of passing power, and the quick shifter on the highway feels great. But again, the power's just so linear. I don't feel any need to rev the bike out. I don't feel like I'm chasing some high. It results in kind of a bland experience. And because the experience is bland, I'm noticing some of the inherent flaws in this motorcycle more. And I'm not talking about those flaws that create character. I'm talking about those flaws that are flaws. The motor is buzzy. I'm getting a lot of vibration in the handlebars, especially higher up in the power band. My lower half is scrunched up into a ball, and despite me having room on this bike, I'm uncomfortable. Also, since I'm not chasing some top-end rush, I'm noticing the lack of cruise control on this motorcycle more. I feel like I just want to set it and forget it and let the bike take care of the work.
Unfortunately, that doesn't really improve when you get on the street. On the street, this thing just feels like you're constantly asking the question, why? It is so clearly the wrong tool for the job. And, you know, you can have some fun with how much torque this thing produces. It's really linear, it's really easy to use. But because you're getting bored coming to a stop constantly, you start to notice the flaws a little bit more. One thing that has always irked me about the speed and street triples specifically is how the gear shifter feels. This is one of the worst gear shift feels when you're not using the quick shifter I've ever felt. No matter what you're doing, there's always some slop and play in this lever, and it never feels like it's engaging all the way. It's very, very annoying, especially on a motorcycle that is as premium as this thing is.
But it's not just a chintzy feeling transmission that gets me, it's the fact that they did such a good job designing everything from the headstock back and then just half-assed the headlight. So many people point to the angry eyebrows that the DRLs make and say it's ugly, and while beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I will say that it looks weirdly half-finished. There are so many nice flowing lines and a few sharp edges that give this bike a mean look, and then they just slap this insectoid looking headlight on the front. I know they're trying to call back to the old twin headlight setup on the 1050, but I would much rather have one round headlight than whatever this is. The problem is there's an air scoop built into the headlight that feeds directly into the airbox, so you can't just slap a daymaker on there and call it a day. This is one of those little niggles with this bike that builds up because the rest of the package is just so good. When you get used to the flawless experience, the littlest things become irritating. It's the princess and the pea, except in this case, it's the street triple and the ugly headlight.
Now, speaking of ugly, we have to talk about the chief competition to the Street Triple R here, and that is the MT-09. There's definitely some other bikes in that category, Duke 890, to a lesser extent the Duke 790, and to an even lesser extent the CF Moto 800 NK. But I would argue that most people who are looking at something like this bike are also looking at the Yamaha. For most people, when they're looking at R versus base model MT-09, I think almost everybody would agree that the Street Triple R here is the better motorcycle of the two. The base model MT-09, it struggles a little bit to make the case for itself, but honestly, if it were my money, I would prefer to drop the coin on the MT-09 base model versus this bike, because the MT-09 has a lot more personality to me. That bike accelerates like a freaking R1. It's staggering how awesome that motorcycle is. Now, don't let that detract from this bike. It's a great competitor, and like I said a few minutes before, I think the specs are in this bike's favor. But I don't know, man. I don't know. The Yamaha calls to me more than this one does.
If you went out and bought this motorcycle right now, I could not tell you that you bought a bad motorcycle, nor could I tell you that you made the wrong choice. This thing is excellent. It's just not for me. But that's the joy of motorcycling. There are so many different types of bikes out there, from deeply flawed power cruisers to absolutely excellent leader bikes that are admittedly pretty horrible on the street. You have so many different choices out there, and you know what? If this is your bag, more power to you, man. This thing is better than any motorcycle I own. Let me know all your thoughts on the Street Triple R right here, and let me know if you think I'm stupid for putting too much emphasis on bikes having character and flaws and having a perfect motorcycle actually detracting from that bike. I know some people down there in the comments are gonna let me have it for it, but that's just my 2 cents. With all that being said, guys, I'm gonna continue riding this bike around while I've got it, because it is fun, despite not being my bag, and I'll catch you in the next one. See you later.